Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family. Chloe, Kathy with a C, Amanda, Kathy with a K, Anne, Carrie, and a special welcome back to Megan. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, full books, and giveaways found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's journey to sleep with more from Sailing Alone Around the World by Captain Joshua Slocum, first published in the year 1900. Let's pick up right where we left off at Chapter 5, as the Spray departs from Gibraltar. Let's begin. Chapter 5. Monday, August 25th, the Spray sailed from Gibraltar, well repaid for whatever deviation she had made from a direct course to reach the place. A tug belonging to Her Majesty towed the sloop into the steady breeze clear of the mount, where her sails caught a volant wind, which carried her once more to the Atlantic, where it rose rapidly to a furious gale. My plan was, in going down this coast, to haul offshore well clear of the land, which hereabouts is the home of pirates. But I had hardly accomplished this when I perceived a felucca making out of the nearest port, and finally following in the wake of the Spray. Now, my course to Gibraltar had been taken with a view to proceed up the Mediterranean Sea, through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea, and east about, instead of a western route which I finally adopted. By officers of vast experience in navigating these seas, I was influenced to make the change. Longshore pirates on both coasts being numerous, I could not afford to make light of the advice. But here I was, after all, evidently in the midst of pirates and thieves. I changed my course. The felucca did the same. Both vessels sailing very fast, but the distance growing less and less between us. The Spray was doing nobly. She was even more than at her best. But in spite of all I could do, she would broach now and then. She was carrying too much sail for safety. I must reef or be dismasted and lose all, pirate or no pirate. I must reef, even if I had to grapple with him for my life. I was not long in reefing the mainsail and sweating it up, probably not more than 15 minutes, but the felucca had in the meantime so shortened the distance between us that I now saw the tuft of hair on the heads of the crew, by which, it is said, Mohammed will pull the villains up into heaven, and they were coming on like the wind. From what I could clearly make out now, I felt them to be the sons of generations of pirates, and I saw by their movements that they were now preparing to strike a blow. The exultation on their faces, however, was changed in an instant to a look of fear and rage. Their craft, with too much sail on, broached to on the crest of a great wave. This one great sea changed the aspect of affairs suddenly as the flash of a gun. 3 minutes later, the same wave overtook the Spray and shook her in every timber. At the same moment, the sheet strop parted, and away went the main boom, broken short at the rigging. Impulsively, I sprang to the jib halyards and downhaul, and instantly down the jib. The headsail being off and the helm put hard down, the sloop came in the wind with a bound. While shivering there, but a moment though it was, I got the mainsail down and secured inboard, broken boom and all. How I got the boom in before the sail was torn I hardly know, but not a stitch of it was broken. The mainsail being secured, I hoisted away the jib, and without looking round, stepped quickly to the cabin and snatched down my loaded rifle and cartridges at hand, for I made mental calculations that the pirate would by this time have recovered his course and be close aboard, and that when I saw him it would be better for me to be looking at him along the barrel of a gun. The piece was at my shoulder when I peered into the mist, but there was no pirate within a mile. The wave and squall that carried away my boom dismasted the felucca outright. I perceived his thieving crew, some dozen or more of them, struggling to recover their rigging from the sea. I sailed comfortably on under the jib and forestaysail, which I now set. I fished the boom and furled the sail snug for the night, then hauled the sloop's head 2 points offshore, to allow for the set of current and heavy rollers toward the land. This gave me the wind 3 points on the starboard quarter and a steady pull in the headsails. By the time I had things in this order, it was dark, and a flying fish had already fallen on deck. I took him below for my supper, but found myself too tired to cook, or even to eat a thing already prepared. I do not remember to have been more tired before or since in all my life than I was at the finish of that day. Too fatigued to sleep, I rolled about with the motion of the vessel till near midnight, when I made shift to dress my fish and prepare a dish of tea. I fully realized now, if I had not before, that the voyage ahead would call for exertions ardent and lasting. On August 27th, nothing could be seen of the Moor or his country either except 2 peaks away in the east through the clear atmosphere of morning. Soon after the sun rose, even these were obscured by haze, much to my satisfaction. The wind, for a few days following my escape from the pirates, blew a steady but moderate gale, and the sea, though agitated with long rollers, was not uncomfortably rough or dangerous, and while sitting in my cabin, I could hardly realize that any sea was running at all. So easy was the long, swinging motion of the sloop over the waves. All distracting uneasiness and excitement being now over, I was once more alone with myself in the realization that I was on the mighty sea and in the hands of the elements. But I was happy and was becoming more and more interested in the voyage. Columbus in the Santa Maria, sailing these seas more than 400 years before, was not so happy as I, nor so sure of success in what he had undertaken. His first troubles at sea had already begun. His crew had managed, by foul play or otherwise, to break the ship's rudder, while running before probably just such a gale as the Spray had passed through, and there was dissension on the Santa Maria, something that was unknown on the Spray. After 3 days of squalls and shifting winds, I threw myself down to rest and sleep, while with helm lashed, the sloop sailed steadily on her course. September 1st in the early morning, land clouds rising ahead told of the Canary Islands not far away. A change in the weather came next day. Storm clouds stretched their arms across the sky. From the east, to all appearances, might come a fierce harmattan, or from the south might come the fierce hurricane. Every point of the compass threatened a wild storm. My attention was turned to reefing sails, and no time was to be lost over it either, for the sea in a moment was confusion itself, and I was glad to head the sloop 3 points or more away from her true course, that she might ride safely over the waves. I was now scudding her for the channel between Africa and the island of Fuerteventura, the easternmost of the Canary Islands, for which I was on the lookout. At 2 p.m., the weather becoming suddenly fine, the island stood in view, already abeam to starboard and not more than 7 miles off. Fuerteventura is 2,700 feet high, and in fine weather is visible many leagues away. The wind freshened in the night, and the Spray had a fine run through the channel. By daylight, September 3rd, she was 25 miles clear of all the islands when a calm ensued, which was the precursor of another gale of wind that soon came on, bringing with it dust from the African shore. It howled dismally while it lasted, and though it was not the season of the harmattan, the sea in the course of an hour was discolored with a reddish-brown dust. The air remained thick with flying dust all the afternoon, but the wind, veering northwest at night, swept it back to land and afforded the Spray once more a clear sky. Her mast now bent under a strong, steady pressure, and her bellying sail swept the sea as she rolled scuppers under, curtsying to the waves. These rolling waves thrilled me as they tossed my ship, passing quickly under her keel. This was grand sailing. September 4th, the wind still fresh, blew from the north-northeast, and the sea surged along with the sloop. About noon, a steamship, a bullock drogher, from the River Plate, hove in sight, steering northeast and making bad weather of it. I signaled her but got no answer. She was plunging into the head sea and rolling in the most astonishing manner, and from the way she yawed, one might have said that a wild steer was at the helm. On the morning of September 6th, I found 3 flying fish on deck, and a 4th one down the fore scuttle, as close as possible to the frying pan. It was the best haul yet, and afforded me a sumptuous breakfast and dinner. The Spray had now settled down to the trade winds and to the business of her voyage. Later in the day, another drogher hove in sight, rolling as badly as her predecessor. I threw out no flag to this one, but got the worst of it for passing under her lee. She was indeed a stale one, and the poor cattle, how they bellowed. The time was when ships passing one another at sea backed their topsails and had a gam, and on parting fired guns, but those good old days have gone. People have hardly time nowadays to speak even on the broad ocean, where news is news, and as for a salute of guns, they cannot afford the powder. There are no poetry-enshrined freighters on the sea now. It is a prosy life, when we have no time to bid one another good morning. My ship, running now in the full swing of the trades, left me days to myself for rest and recuperation. I employed the time in reading and writing, or in whatever I found to do about the rigging and the sails to keep them all in order. The cooking was always done quickly and was a small matter, as the bill of fare consisted mostly of flying fish, hot biscuits and butter, potatoes, coffee and cream, dishes readily prepared. On September 10th, the Spray passed the island of San Antonio, the northwesternmost of the Cape Verdes, close aboard. The landfall was wonderfully true, considering that no observations for longitude had been made. The wind northeast, as the sloop drew by the island, was very squally, but I reefed her sails snug and steered broad from the highland of blustering San Antonio. Then, leaving the Cape Verde Islands out of sight astern, I found myself once more sailing a lonely sea, and in a solitude supreme all around. When I slept, I dreamed that I was alone. This feeling never left me, but sleeping or waking, I seemed always to know the position of the sloop, and I saw my vessel moving across the chart, which became a picture before me. One night while I sat in the cabin under this spell, the profound stillness all about was broken by human voices alongside. I sprang instantly to the deck, startled beyond my power to tell. Passing close under lee like an apparition was a white bark under full sail. The sailors on board of her were hauling on ropes to brace the yards, which just cleared the sloop's mast as she swept by. No one hailed from the white-winged flyer, but I heard someone on board say that he saw lights on the sloop and that he made her out to be a fisherman. I sat long on the starlit deck that night, thinking of ships and watching the constellations on their voyage. On the following day, September 13th, a large four-masted ship passed some distance to windward, heading north. The sloop was now rapidly drawing toward the region of doldrums, and the force of the trade winds was lessening. I could see by the ripples that a countercurrent had set in. This I estimated to be about 16 miles a day. In the heart of the counter stream, the rate was more than that setting eastward. September 14th, A lofty three-masted ship heading north was seen from the masthead. Neither this ship nor the one seen yesterday was within signal distance, yet it was good even to see them. On the following day, heavy rain clouds rose in the south, obscuring the sun. This was ominous of doldrums. On the 16th, the Spray entered this gloomy region to battle with squalls and to be harassed by fitful calms, for this is the state of the elements between the northeast and the southeast trades, where each wind, struggling in turn for mastery, expends its force whirling about in all directions. Making this still more trying to one's nerve and patience, the sea was tossed into confused cross lumps and fretted by eddying currents. As if something more were needed to complete a sailor's discomfort in this state, the rain poured down in torrents day and night. The Spray struggled and tossed for 10 days, making only 300 miles on her course in all that time. I didn't say anything. On September 23rd, the fine schooner Nantasket of Boston, from Bear River for the River Plate, lumber-laden and just through the doldrums, came up with the Spray, and her captain passing a few words, she sailed on. Being much fouled on the bottom by shellfish, she drew along with her fishes which had been following the Spray, which was less provided with that sort of food. Fishes will always follow a foul ship. A barnacle-grown log adrift has the same attraction for deep-sea fishes. One of this little school of deserters was a dolphin that had followed the Spray about 1,000 miles, and had been content to eat scraps of food thrown overboard from my table, for having been wounded, it could not dart through the sea to prey on other fishes. I had become accustomed to seeing the dolphin, which I knew by its scars, and missed it whenever it took occasional excursions away from the sloop. One day, after it had been off some hours, it returned in company with 3 yellowtails, a sort of cousin to the dolphin. This little school kept together, except when in danger and when foraging about the sea. Their lives were often threatened by hungry sharks that came round the vessel, and more than once they had narrow escapes. Their mode of escape interested me greatly, and I passed hours watching them. They would dart away, each in a different direction, so that the wolf of the sea, the shark, pursuing one, would be led away from the others. Then, after a while, they would all return and rendezvous under one side or the other of the sloop. Twice their pursuers were diverted by a tin pan, which I towed astern of the sloop, and which was mistaken for a bright fish, and while turning in the peculiar way that sharks have when about to devour their prey, I shot them through the head. Their precarious life seemed to concern the yellowtails very little, if at all. All living beings, without doubt, are afraid of death. Nevertheless, some of the species I saw huddled together, as though they knew they were created for the larger fishes, and wished to give the least possible trouble to their captors. I have seen, on the other hand, whales swimming in a circle around a school of herrings, and with mighty exertion bunching them together in a whirlpool set in motion by their flukes. And when the small fry were all whirled nicely together, one or the other of the leviathans, lunging through the center with open jaws, take in a boatload or so at a single mouthful. Off the Cape of Good Hope, I saw schools of sardines or other small fish being treated in this way by great numbers of cavally fish. There was not the slightest chance of escape for the sardines, while the cavally circled round and round, feeding from the edge of the mass. It was interesting to note how rapidly the small fry disappeared, and though it was repeated before my eyes over and over, I could hardly perceive the capture of a single sardine, so dexterously was it done. Along the equatorial limit of the southeast trade winds, the air was heavily charged with electricity, and there was much thunder and lightning. It was hereabout I remembered that a few years before, the American ship Alert was destroyed by lightning. Her people, by wonderful good fortune, were rescued on the same day and brought to Pernambuco, where I then met them. On September 25th, in the latitude of 5 degrees north, longitude 26 degrees 30 minutes west, I spoke the ship North Star of London. The great ship was out 48 days from Norfolk, Virginia, and was bound for Rio, where we met again about 2 months later. The Spray was now 30 days from Gibraltar. The Spray's next companion of the voyage was a swordfish that swam alongside, showing its tall fin out of the water, till I made a stir for my harpoon, when it hauled its black flag down and disappeared. September 30th, at 11:30 in the morning, the Spray crossed the equator in longitude 29 degrees 30 minutes west. At noon, she was 2 miles south of the line. The southeast trade winds, met rather light in about 4 degrees north, gave her sails now a stiff full, sending her handsomely over the sea toward the coast of Brazil, where on October 5th, just north of Olinda Point, without further incident, she made the land, casting anchor in Pernambuco harbor about noon, 40 days from Gibraltar, and all well on board. Did I tire of the voyage in all that time? Not a bit of it. I was never in better trim in all my life, and was eager for the more perilous experience of rounding the Horn. It was not at all strange in a life common to sailors, that having already crossed the Atlantic twice, and being now halfway from Boston to the Horn, I should find myself still among friends. My determination to sail westward from Gibraltar not only enabled me to escape the pirates of the Red Sea, but in bringing me to Pernambuco, landed me on familiar shores. I had made many voyages to this and other ports in Brazil. In 1893, I was employed as master to take the famous Erickson ship Destroyer from New York to Brazil to go against the rebel Mello and his party. The Destroyer, by the way, carried a submarine cannon of enormous length. In the same expedition went the Nictheroy, the ship purchased by the United States government during the Spanish War and renamed the Buffalo. The Destroyer was in many ways the better ship of the two, but the Brazilians in their curious war sank her themselves at Bahia. With her sank my hope of recovering wages due me. Still, I could but try to recover, for to me it meant a great deal. But now, within 2 years, the whirligig of time had brought the Mello party into power, and although it was the legal government which had employed me, the so-called rebels felt under less obligation to me than I could have wished. During these visits to Brazil, I had made the acquaintance of Dr. Pereira, owner and editor of El Comercio Jornal, and soon after the Spray was safely moored in upper topsail reach, the doctor, who was a very enthusiastic yachtsman, came to pay me a visit and to carry me up the waterway of the lagoon to his country residence. The approach to his mansion by the waterside was guarded by his armada, a fleet of boats including a Chinese sampan, a Norwegian pram, and a Cape Ann dory, the last of which he obtained from the destroyer. The doctor dined me often on good Brazilian fare, that I might, as he said, sale gordo for the voyage. But he found that even on the best, I fattened slowly. Fruits and vegetables and all other provisions necessary for the voyage having been taken in, on the 23rd of October I unmoored and made ready for sea. Here I encountered one of the unforgiving mellow faction in the person of the collector of customs, who charged the Spray tonnage dues when she cleared, notwithstanding that she sailed with a yacht license and should have been exempt from port charges. Our consul reminded the collector of this, and of the fact, without much diplomacy I thought, that it was I who brought the destroyer to Brazil. "Oh yes," said the bland collector, "we remember it very well, for it was now in a small way his turn." Mr. Lundgren, a merchant, to help me out of the trifling difficulty, offered to freight the Spray with a cargo of gunpowder for Bahia, which would have put me in funds. And when the insurance companies refused to take the risk on cargo shipped on a vessel manned by a crew of only one, he offered to ship it without insurance, taking all the risk himself. This was perhaps paying me a greater compliment than I deserved. The reason why I did not accept the business was that in so doing, I found that I should vitiate my yacht license and run into more expense for harbor dues around the world than the freight would amount to. Instead of all this, another old merchant friend came to my assistance, advancing the cash direct. While at Pernambuco, I shortened the boom, which had been broken when off the coast of Morocco, by removing the broken piece, which took about 4 feet off the inboard end. I also refitted the jaws. On October 24th, 1895, a fine day even as days go in Brazil, the Spray sailed, having had abundant good cheer. Making about 100 miles a day along the coast, I arrived at Rio de Janeiro November 5th, without any event worth mentioning, and about noon cast anchor near Villa Ganon to await the official port visit. On the following day I bestirred myself to meet the highest lord of the Admiralty and the ministers, to inquire concerning the matter of wages due me from the beloved destroyer. The high official I met said, "Captain, so far as we are concerned, you may have the ship, and if you care to accept her, we will send an officer to show you where she is." I knew well enough where she was at that moment. It was more than likely that she rested on the bottom there. I thanked the kind officer, but declined his offer. The Spray, with a number of old shipmasters on board, sailed about the harbor of Rio the day before she put to sea. As I had decided to give the Spray a yawl rig for the tempestuous waters of Patagonia, I here placed on the stern a semicircular brace to support a jigger mast. These old captains inspected the spray's rigging, and each one contributed something to her outfit. Captain Jones, who had acted as my interpreter at Rio, gave her an anchor, and one of the steamers gave her a cable to match it. She never dragged Jones's anchor once on the voyage, and the cable not only stood the strain on a lee shore, but when towed off Cape Horn, helped break combing seas astern that threatened to board her. Chapter 6. On November 28, the Spray sailed from Rio de Janeiro, and first of all ran into a gale of wind, which tore up things generally along the coast, doing considerable damage to shipping. It was well for her, perhaps, that she was clear of the land. Coasting along on this part of the voyage, I observed that while some of the small vessels I fell in with were able to outsail the Spray by day, they fell astern of her at night. To the Spray, day and night were the same. To the others, clearly there was a difference. On one of the very fine days experienced after leaving Rio, the steamship South Wales spoke the Spray, and unsolicited gave them longitude by chronometer at 48 degrees west, as near as I can make it, the captain said. The Spray, with her tin clock, had exactly the same reckoning. I was feeling at ease in my primitive method of navigation, but it startled me not a little to find my position by a count verified by the ship's chronometer. On December 5th, a barkentine hove in sight, and for several days the two vessels sailed along the coast together. Right here a current was experienced setting north, making it necessary to hug the shore, with which the Spray became rather familiar. Here I confess a weakness. I hugged the shore entirely too close. In a word, at daybreak on the morning of December 11th, the Spray ran hard and fast on the beach. This was annoying, but I soon found that the sloop was in no great danger. The false appearance of the sand hills under a bright moon had deceived me, and I lamented now that I had trusted to appearances at all. The sea, though moderately smooth, still carried a swell which broke with some force on the shore. I managed to launch my small dory from the deck and ran out a kedge anchor and warp, but it was too late to kedge the sloop off, for the tide was falling and she had already sewed a foot. Then I went about laying out the large anchor, which was no easy matter, for my only lifeboat, the frail dory, when the anchor and cable were in it, was swamped at once in the surf, the load being too great for her. Then I cut the cable and made 2 loads of it instead of 1. The anchor, with 40 fathoms bent and already buoyed, I now took and succeeded in getting through the surf. But my dory was leaking fast, and by the time I had rowed far enough to drop the anchor, she was full to the gunwale and sinking. There was not a moment to spare, and I saw clearly that if I failed now all might be lost. I sprang from the oars to my feet, and lifting the anchor above my head, threw it clear just as she was turning over. I grasped her gunwale and held on as she turned bottom up, for I suddenly remembered that I could not swim. Then I tried to right her, but with too much eagerness, for she rolled clean over and left me as before, clinging to her gunwale, while my body was still in the water. Giving a moment to cool reflection, I found that although the wind was blowing moderately toward the land, the current was carrying me to sea, and that something would have to be done. 3 times I had been under water in trying to right the dory, and I was just saying, "Now I lay me," when I was seized by a determination to try yet once more, so that no one of the prophets of evil I had left behind me could say I told you so. Whatever the danger may have been, much or little, I can truly say that the moment was the most serene of my life. After righting the dory for the 4th time, I finally succeeded by the utmost care in keeping her upright while I hauled myself into her and with one of the oars which I had recovered, paddled to the shore, somewhat the worse for wear and pretty full of salt water. The position of my vessel, now high and dry, gave me anxiety. To get her afloat again was all I thought of or cared for. I had little difficulty in carrying the second part of my cable out and securing it to the first, which I had taken the precaution to buoy before I put it into the boat. To bring the end back to the sloop was a smaller matter still, and I believe I chuckled above my sorrows when I found that in all the haphazard, my judgment or my good genius had faithfully stood by me. The cable reached from the anchor in deep water to the sloop's windlass by just enough to secure a turn and no more. The anchor had been dropped at the right distance from the vessel. To heave all taut now and wait for the coming tide was all I could do. I had already done enough work to tire a stouter man, and was only too glad to throw myself on the sand above the tide and rest, for the sun was already up and pouring a generous warmth over the land. While my state could have been worse, I was on the wild coast of a foreign country, and not entirely secure in my property, as I soon found out. I had not been long on the shore when I heard the patter-patter of a horse's feet approaching along the hard beach, which ceased as it came abreast of the sand ridge where I lay sheltered from the wind. Looking up cautiously, I saw mounted on a nag probably the most astonished boy on the whole coast. He had found a sloop. It must be mine, he thought, for am I not the first to see it on the beach? Sure enough, there it was, all high and dry and painted white. He trotted his horse around it, and finding no owner, hitched the nag to the sloop's bobstay, and hauled as though he would take her home. But of course she was too heavy for one horse to move. With my skiff, however, it was different. This he hauled some distance and concealed behind a dune in a bunch of tall grass. He had made up his mind, I dare say, to bring more horses and drag his bigger prize away, and was starting off for the settlement a mile or so away for the reinforcement, when I discovered myself to him, at which he seemed displeased and disappointed. "Buenos dias, muchacho," I said. He grunted a reply and eyed me keenly from head to foot, then bursting into a volley of questions, more than 6 Yankees could ask. He wanted to know first where my ship was from and how many days she had been coming. Then he asked what I was doing here ashore so early in the morning. "Your questions are easily answered," I replied. "My ship is from the moon. It has taken her a month to come, and she is here for a cargo of boys." But the intimation of this enterprise, had I not been on the alert, might have cost me dearly. For while I spoke, this child of the Campo coiled his lariat ready to throw, and instead of being himself carried to the moon, he was apparently thinking of towing me home by the neck, astern of his wild cayuse over the fields of Uruguay. The exact spot where I was stranded was at the Castillo Chicos, about 7 miles south of the dividing line of Uruguay and Brazil, and of course the natives there speak Spanish. To reconcile my early visitor, I told him that I had on my ship biscuits and that I wished to trade them for butter and milk. On hearing this, a broad grin lighted up his face and showed that he was greatly interested, and that even in Uruguay a ship's biscuit will cheer the heart of a boy and make him your bosom friend. The lad almost flew home and returned quickly with butter, milk, and eggs. I was, after all, in a land of plenty. With the boy came others, old and young, from neighboring ranches, among them a German settler who was of great assistance to me in many ways. A coast guard from Fort Teresa, a few miles away, also came to protect your property from the natives of the plains, he said. I took occasion to tell him, however, that if he would look after the people of his own village, I would take care of those from the plains, pointing as I spoke to the nondescript merchant who had already stolen my revolver and several small articles from my cabin, which by a bold front I had recovered. The chap was not a native Uruguayan. Here, as in many other places that I visited, the natives themselves were not the ones discreditable to the country. Early in the day, a dispatch came from the port captain of Montevideo, commanding the coast guards to render the Spray every assistance. This, however, was not necessary, for a guard was already on the alert, and making all the ado that would become the wreck of a steamer with 1,000 emigrants aboard. The same messenger brought word from the port captain that he would dispatch a steam tug to tow the Spray to Montevideo. The officer was as good as his word. A powerful tug arrived on the following day, but to make a long story short, with the help of the German and one soldier and one Italian called Angel of Milan, I had already floated the sloop and was sailing for port with the boom off before a fair wind. The adventure cost the Spray no small amount of pounding on the hard sand. She lost her shoe and part of her false keel, and received other damage, which, however, was readily mended afterward in dock. On the following day I anchored at Maldonado. The British consul, his daughter, and another young lady came on board, bringing with them a basket of fresh eggs, strawberries, bottles of milk, and a great loaf of sweet bread. This was a good landfall, and better cheer than I had found at Maldonado once upon a time, when I entered the port with a stricken crew in my bark, the Echidnic. In the waters of Maldonado Bay a variety of fishes abound, and fur seals in their season haul out on the island abreast the bay to breed. Currents on this coast are greatly affected by the prevailing winds, and a tidal wave higher than that ordinarily produced by the moon is sent up the whole shore of Uruguay before a southwest gale, or lowered by a northeaster, as may happen. One of these waves having just receded, before the northeast wind which brought the spray in left the tide now at low ebb, with oyster rocks laid bare for some distance along the shore. Other shellfish of good flavor were also plentiful, though small in size. I gathered a mess of oysters and mussels here, while a native with hook and line and with mussels for bait fished from a point of detached rocks for bream, landing several good-sized ones. The fisherman's nephew, a lad about 7 years old, deserves mention as the tallest blasphemer for a short boy that I met on the voyage. He called his old uncle all the vile names under the sun for not helping him across the gully, while he swore roundly in all the moods and tenses of the Spanish language. His uncle fished on, now and then congratulating his hopeful nephew on his accomplishment. At the end of his rich vocabulary, the urchin sauntered off into the fields and shortly returned with a bunch of flowers, and with all smiles handed them to me with the innocence of an angel. I remembered having seen the same flower on the banks of the river farther up some years before. I asked the young pirate why he had brought them to me. Said he, "I don't know, I only wished to do so." Whatever the influence was that put so amiable a wish in this wild pampa boy, it must be far-reaching, thought I, and potent seas over. Shortly after, the Spray sailed for Montevideo, where she arrived on the following day and was greeted by steam whistles, till I felt embarrassed and wished that I had arrived unobserved. The voyage so far alone may have seemed to the Uruguayans a feat worthy of some recognition, but there was so much of it yet ahead, and of such an arduous nature, that any demonstration at this point seemed somehow like boasting prematurely. The Spray had barely come to anchor at Montevideo when the agents of the Royal Mail Steamship Company, Messrs. Humphreys and Co., sent word that they would dock and repair her free of expense and give me £20 sterling, which they did to the letter and more besides. The caulkers at Montevideo paid very careful attention to the work of making the sloop tight. Carpenters mended the keel and also the lifeboat, my dory, painting it till I hardly knew it from a butterfly. And with that stroke of generous good fortune, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Sailing Alone Around the World. What a wonderful voyage, tailor-made for dreams. I hope you're enjoying this. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.